all, so today I'll be teaching you the basics of gouache. So, for those of you who don't know, gouache is a water-based paint medium. It has a matte finish and it is an opaque medium. So gouache is somewhere in between acrylics and watercolors. Generally, I would say gouache veers a little bit more towards watercolors, as you can put some paint on a palette, you can let it dry down, and you can re-wet it. You can also re-wet previous layers on the paper, and you can get some interesting blends like that. But it is super opaque, and you can layer it really well. You can even do light colors on top of dark colors, unlike watercolor. There is something also called acrylic gouache, which is more like acrylics in that when it dries down, you cannot move it. However, we won't be talking about that today. So, first, materials. What materials do you need to have in order to paint with gouache? Well, you're going to need gouache, you're going to need paintbrushes, water, and paper. For paper, I recommend a standard watercolor paper. I personally prefer a cold press watercolor paper, and I don't think it really matters how heavy the weight is. You don't need to go super heavy with gouache paints. Maybe slightly thicker than 140 GSM, but I think it works pretty well still. And you can use any grade of watercolor paper. I'll try to stick with some nicer ones, maybe Strathmore. Arches is really, it's so beautiful with gouaches, but it's so expensive, so you do not need that at all. I find that even some mixed media papers work with gouache pretty well. The Canson XL mixed media paper I really like with that. That's it for papers. For brushes, for gouaches, I recommend a nice snappy synthetic brush. I don't think natural hair brushes work terribly well with it, but I still would use a watercolor brush. Just get a watercolor brush that's more on the stiff side instead of the soft side. So the Princeton brushes that come like this, they're little like student grade ones that are nylon fibers. These ones work really well. I actually really like angle brushes for gouache work. I don't know why. I don't generally love angled brushes or flat brushes, but I find that it lays down the color really nicely. Then the next thing that you're going to want to have is just a water jar. I just use these little mason jar type things and they work really well, but you can use anything that will hold water. You'll also probably want to have a paper towel nearby just to clean off your brush and get it a little bit more dry. The final, and perhaps the most important part of painting with gouache is the gouache part. So, the gouaches that I prefer to use are these ones. These are M-gram gouaches. These are artist grade gouaches, and they are super nice. For gouache in particular, I recommend getting a nicer quality paint if you can afford it. You don't need that many colors. I don't use that many colors. You don't necessarily have to use the white of the paper to get light colors. You can mix it with white, and I do definitely recommend buying a white. But you don't need as many colors as you generally need with watercolors, and I think that a limited palette is really useful, especially when you're starting out learning color mixing. You can also get sets like this. This is actually a nice set that's relatively inexpensive. It's the Himi gouache set. So it comes in the little box with the jelly cups like this. Enter B-roll. This one is really nice because it comes with a bunch of different colors, a lot of it, and it isn't super expensive. Now, if you're going to buy a set of gouaches, the colors that I'd recommend, you only really need 5, are cadmium red, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, ivory black, and titanium white. These basic colors, you can mix almost anything. Now, in my personal set, I do have a few extra colors, and that's just because I can't mix super vibrant colors with this primary set. So I do have a Hooker's Green, a Phthalocyanine Blue, just because I wanted that bright kind of peacock blue color, and then I have a Dioxazine Purple and a Quinacridone Rose. And those are just extra colors that you don't actually need. It's just they're a bit more vibrant and they add something to my own work, but you'll find what you want as you work with them more. For the gouaches, you're probably going to need a palette, especially if you get something like this in the tube form. So what I recommend doing is buying a really cheap porcelain plate. Now, plates like this one I believe cost about $3 from Target. It has a nice open square space where you can mix a lot, and then I just poured like a tiny little drop of paint onto all the corners in the way that I thought would make sense, and I use it like that. Every once in a while you'll need to wash it, and definitely don't use it for food afterwards because pigments like cadmium can actually be toxic. You probably won't die, but if you do ingest a lot of it, you can get really sick from it. But I would recommend using something like that. And then even if you get something like the Himi palette, I would recommend just getting a smaller plate to use on the side of it. Okay, so for my second step, or part of the basics of learning gouache, is just actually doing it. So how does one go about actually painting with gouache? You have the materials, but now what do you do? So what I would do is I would recommend starting out just by pouring out some gouache onto your palette of choice. Or if you got a set, just unwrapping them. So here is how I would recommend to lay out your palette. I would recommend putting your yellows and your blues on opposite sides of the palette as far away as possible from one another. Unless you are planning on specifically doing a bunch of landscapes or floral paintings, I think that it's much easier to get a red out of a yellow than it is to get a blue out of a yellow. Just because blue can be such a strong color that it ends up turning your yellow green, even by accident. Then I would recommend having at least 2 puddles of white, just so you can use one for more blue colors and one for more warm colors. You don't necessarily need both, but I think that it's easier and it just keeps things a bit more clean and less muddy. And then keep your black next to the blue. That's what I just do. You can figure out what works best for you. Alright, so for today, what we're going to do is I'll just be going over a bit of the color mixing. So we have the standard primaries in this set. This is what we're going to be using today. And with this set, we're just going to be going over the basic color mixes. We all learned these probably in kindergarten, but I'll go over them again. So we have the primaries, which are red, blue, and yellow. The reason that they're primary is because you can't really mix them by themselves. Then we have the secondary colors. So we have red and blue, that makes purple. Purple is a secondary color. Then we have blue and yellow, that makes green. And then we have red and yellow, which makes orange. So those are your basic colors, and you'll use different amounts of each color, and as you get better and better at mixing colors, you'll figure out which proportions to use without even thinking about it. Then, if you want to get skin tones, what I recommend doing is mixing a red and a yellow, and then adding white to it. That's how you get more pale skin tones. And then for darker skin tones, I actually like mixing a bit of red, yellow, and blue all together. Less blue than red and yellow, and then also adding a bit of black into it. So mess with these proportions and do your best. So next we'll just have a little demo painting. It will be super fast speed video of it, but the way I recommend going about doing gouache paintings is getting all your main shadows and highlights in place. So you want to kind of build up the painting, and this is super hard to explain in a very short video, but you just want to build up the layers. You want to make sure that you start with the shadows. You want to start with the main and most prominent colors, and then you build up from there. So I like to block in the main features because I do portraits a lot. Blocking in the main features like the shadow on the nose or the jawline, other things like that. and then building out from there. I like to go in with a lot of washes and glazing because I use watercolors most of the time, but when I'm using gouaches, I tend to use similar techniques, and you can still bleed gouaches like you would with watercolors and using similar techniques like that. So that is all I have for the basics of gouache today. I know it wasn't super detailed on the actual painting process, but it is very difficult to fit all of that information in one small video. One of the artists that I would recommend looking at for learning gouache is on Skillshare and on YouTube is Arlisha Yetzer. She's an amazing watercolor and gouache artist who teaches classes on how to do it, and her classes are excellent. And then also there is another artist named Miriam Tilson, Miriam spelled with a Y, and she's on YouTube, and she has this video where she talks about everything that she has learned about gouache. It's like 45 minutes long, but it is super useful and a really great informational overall video. So I hope that was a little bit helpful, and have fun painting. Bye!